Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel.
Sara had always been good at starting things. Her bookshelf was lined with half-filled journals, each representing a different burst of inspiration. There was the sleek black notebook she bought when she decided to learn French, the colorful planner meant to organize her fitness journey, and the leather-bound diary where she promised herself she'd write every day. They all had one thing in common. They were abandoned after the first few pages. Tonight was no different. Sara sat cross-legged on her bed, a brand new notebook resting on her lap. She twirled her pen between her fingers, staring at the blank page. The idea for her new blog had hit her like lightning earlier that week. She'd spent hours imagining the perfect posts, the clever titles, the inspiring stories she'd share. She'd even told her best friend, Mia, about it. But now, as the excitement faded, doubt crept in. What if no one reads it? What if I run out of things to say? What if I give up again? Sara sighed, setting the notebook aside. She grabbed her phone and mindlessly scrolled through social media. Everyone else seemed so productive. People were launching businesses, running marathons, writing novels, while she sat here, paralyzed by her own inconsistency. Why do I always lose motivation so quickly? The question lingered in her mind as she stared at the ceiling. Maybe she wasn't cut out for this. Maybe some people were just wired to follow through, and she wasn't one of them. Or maybe she just hadn't found the right reason to keep going. Sara didn't know the answer yet, but she was about to find out. The next morning, Sara woke up feeling that familiar heaviness, the kind that came after another night of giving up. The half-filled notebook sat untouched on her nightstand, a quiet reminder of all the other projects she'd abandoned. She dragged herself out of bed and brewed a cup of coffee, staring blankly out the window as the machine sputtered to life. As she sipped her drink, her mind raced. She hated this feeling, the rush of excitement at the beginning, only to watch it slip through her fingers after a few days. With a sigh, Sara grabbed her laptop and sank into the couch. She opened a search engine and typed, "Why do I always lose motivation so quickly?" The results poured in: blog posts, videos, forums filled with people asking the same question. She clicked on the first link and skimmed through the usual advice. Set smart goals. Break tasks into smaller steps. Visualize your success. Sara rolled her eyes. She'd heard it all before. If writing things down and making to-do lists was enough, she'd have finished a dozen projects by now. She kept scrolling until a headline caught her eye. Find your why. The secret to lasting motivation. Curious, she clicked. The article told a story about a marathon runner who had almost quit training several times, until he connected with his deeper purpose. He wasn't running to win races or get in shape. He was running because his father had dreamed of completing a marathon but never got the chance. Every step he took was for his father's memory. Sara sat back, the words swirling in her mind. Find your why. She'd never really thought about that before. Every time she started something new, it was because it seemed exciting or because she felt like she should be doing it. But maybe that wasn't enough. She grabbed her journal and wrote at the top of a fresh page, "Why do I want to write?" The pen hovered over the paper as she stared at the question. For a long time, nothing came. Then, slowly, she started to write. "I want to write because I've always loved stories. They make me feel alive. When I write, it feels like I'm giving shape to the chaos in my head. And maybe, just maybe, my words could help someone else feel a little less alone." Sara stared at the page. Her chest felt lighter. The haze that had clouded her mind all morning started to clear. She wasn't writing for attention or praise. She was writing because stories had always been her anchor, a way to understand herself and the world. And if that was her why, maybe it was enough to keep going. For the first time in days, Sara felt a flicker of excitement, not the kind that burned bright and faded fast, but something steadier, warmer. She closed her journal, holding it close to her chest, and sat quietly for a moment. Maybe this time would be different. That afternoon, she decided to test her new approach. She brewed a fresh cup of coffee and opened her laptop, the familiar hum filling the room as the screen lit up. Her blog's draft folder stared back at her, filled with half-written posts and unfinished ideas. Sara hovered over the latest draft, "Why We Tell Stories," and took a deep breath. The cursor blinked, waiting. Her old self would have hesitated, waiting for the right words to magically appear. But today, she tried something different. She opened her journal to the page where she'd written her why. She read it quietly, letting the words sink in. I want to write because stories make me feel alive. That was enough. She started typing. The words didn't flow perfectly. Some sentences felt clunky, and she had to resist the urge to go back and edit right away. But she pushed forward. Every time she felt the familiar tug of doubt, she reminded herself that this wasn't about perfection. It was about purpose. An hour later, she sat back and read through what she'd written. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time, that felt like enough. She hit save and closed her laptop, a small smile tugging at her lips. Maybe she'd lost motivation in the past because she'd been chasing the wrong things. But now, she had something stronger than motivation. She had meaning. Sara had hoped that finding her why would magically fix everything. That once she connected with her deeper purpose, the rest would fall into place. But she quickly learned that purpose wasn't a cure-all. It was a compass, not a shortcut. The first week went smoothly. Every morning, she opened her journal, reread the page where she'd written her why, and used that spark to fuel her writing sessions. The words flowed more easily than they ever had before. For the first time, she felt like she was building momentum. But then, life happened. One night, Mia invited her out for dinner, and Sara stayed out late, laughing over plates of pasta and glasses of wine. The next morning, she slept through her alarm and woke up with a pounding headache. She dragged herself out of bed, made a pot of coffee, and collapsed onto the couch. Her laptop sat unopened on the dining table. "I'll write later," she told herself, curling up under a blanket. "I deserve a break." Later turned into never. The day slipped away, and the next morning, the same thing happened. Her phone buzzed with notifications. She got sucked into scrolling, watching other people live their lives while hers drifted past. The days blurred together, and the fog of self-doubt crept back in. One evening, Sara sat alone in her apartment, staring at the blinking cursor of a blank page. Her heart sank. The same cycle was starting all over again. "What's wrong with me?" she whispered. "Why can't I just stay motivated?" She closed her laptop, sinking into the couch. The weight of her own expectations pressed against her chest. It felt like she was doomed to repeat the same pattern, a burst of enthusiasm, followed by a slow unraveling until she quit altogether. But this time, something was different. Instead of wallowing in frustration, Sara reached for her journal. She flipped to the page where she'd first written her why. Her eyes scanned the words, and slowly, they began to sink in again. "I want to write because stories make me feel alive." She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The fog in her mind began to clear. Sara realized that she'd been chasing motivation like it was a feeling that had to be there every day. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe motivation wasn't a constant. Maybe it was a spark, a flicker that got her started, and the rest of the journey was about remembering why she lit the fire in the first place. She grabbed a pen and wrote down a new reminder. Motivation fades. Purpose stays. That night, she didn't force herself to write a masterpiece. She just opened her laptop and typed a single sentence. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Sara was learning that showing up, even on the hard days, mattered more than waiting to feel inspired. And for the first time, she believed that was enough. The next morning, Sara woke up to sunlight streaming through her curtains. She stretched, feeling a quiet resolve settle over her. Today would be different, not because she was suddenly overflowing with motivation, but because she understood now that she didn't need to be. She grabbed her journal and flipped to the page where she'd written. Motivation fades. Purpose stays. The words felt like an anchor, grounding her. She didn't need to write a perfect blog post today. She just needed to show up. Sara slid into her usual spot at the dining table, cradling a warm mug of coffee. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. She opened her laptop and stared at the blank screen. Just one sentence, she told herself. That's all you have to do. Her fingers hovered over the keys. After a few moments, she typed. Some days, motivation is nowhere to be found, but purpose waits patiently in the background. The corners of her lips lifted. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. And something was better than nothing. She kept writing, the words coming slowly at first, then faster. She didn't stop to edit or overthink. The fear of getting it wrong no longer held her hostage. Every time she felt the familiar tug of self-doubt, she whispered her new mantra. Motivation fades. Purpose stays. An hour later, she leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen. Nearly a full page of words blinked back at her. It wasn't a masterpiece, but it was progress. And for the first time, progress felt like enough. The days that followed weren't perfect. Some mornings she wrote for an hour, lost in the flow. Other days, she managed only a few sentences before closing her laptop. But she kept showing up. She realized that momentum wasn't about giant leaps forward. It was about tiny, consistent steps. The act of sitting down, opening her laptop, and typing anything was a victory. And slowly, the victories added up. One evening, she met Mia at their favorite coffee shop. As they sipped their drinks, Mia tilted her head. "You've been quiet lately," she said, smiling. "What have you been up to?" Sara hesitated, then pulled out her phone and opened her blog. She handed it to Mia, heart pounding. "I've been writing." Mia's eyes widened. She scrolled through the posts, her expression softening. "Sara, these are incredible. I had no idea you were working on this." Sara shrugged, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "I guess I finally figured out what keeps me going." Mia set the phone down and squeezed her hand. "I'm proud of you." For the first time, Sara felt proud of herself too. She still had bad days. She still got stuck. But she no longer saw those moments as signs of failure. They were just part of the process, reminders that she was human. And now, when motivation faded, she knew exactly where to turn. She'd found her why, and that was more powerful than any fleeting burst of inspiration. Weeks turned into months, and something unexpected began to happen. Sara's writing routine wasn't perfect, far from it. Some days, she wrote for hours, losing herself in the flow of words. Other days, she barely managed a paragraph. But she showed up, again and again. The more she wrote, the less it felt like a battle against herself. Writing became familiar. Not easy, but familiar. One quiet evening, she sat at her dining table, fingers gliding across the keys. She was finishing a new post called The Art of Showing Up. As she typed the final sentence, a wave of satisfaction washed over her. She leaned back, rereading the words. Motivation is fleeting, but purpose? Purpose is the quiet whisper that calls you back, even when everything else feels heavy. Purpose stays. She exhaled slowly, a soft smile tugging at her lips. It felt right. Sara hovered over the publish button. Her heart raced. No matter how much she wrote, sharing her work with the world still felt vulnerable, like opening a window into her soul and inviting people to peek inside. But she pressed the button anyway. The post went live. She closed her laptop and curled up on the couch with a cup of tea, watching the city lights twinkle outside her window. Her phone buzzed beside her. She picked it up and saw a notification. A comment on her new post. "This is exactly what I needed to read today. Thank you." Sara blinked, reading the words again. A warmth spread through her chest. Her words, her thoughts, her struggles had reached someone. And in that moment, she realized that the power of writing wasn't in getting it perfect. It was in being honest, in showing up, even when it was hard. That night, as she drifted off to sleep, she didn't feel anxious about tomorrow's writing session. She didn't wonder if the motivation would be there or if the words would flow. She knew she'd show up anyway, because motivation wasn't the secret. Purpose was, and she'd never lose that again.